This is going to cover the beginning of Unit 6 and kind of give you an introduction to what memory is in terms of AP psychology. I'm in the Unit 6 MAC notes, so you have access to these if you want to follow along or go back and check out what we've talked about here in this first video. So what we're going to look at here is just the basics, but these notes also include some of the in-class demonstrations we're going to do. And then even at the end of these slides, you'll see kind of a accumulation of all the data from the in-class demonstrations. But here there's some quick links to the different parts of the notes as well. So first we need to ask, if we're talking about memory, what is memory? And it's kind of a nice little segue in from our last unit, which was learning, because think about, like, a lot of times we use those words kind of interchangeably, or we use them as synonyms, memory and learning. And here we're going to see a lot of build on things we've learned already in the class here when we talk about memory in this unit. But really we're just going to define it as acquiring information, storing information, and then retrieving information when we need to use it, right? And you can talk about that in terms of even things like classical conditioning and emotional responses to things in our environment, to like just remembering how to tie your shoes or remembering a psychologist in this class, right? So you can kind of apply this general definition to all of those things. Here you'll see Eric Kandel when we talk about memory and the physiology of memory and the actual neural change when it comes to creating a memory. He did some research on sea slugs and showed that they kind of can have a neurological change based on, in this case, he was shocking the slugs. They were getting a pain response, and he demonstrated the physical change that came along with that psychological change for the slug. All right, so the basics of memory, super simple. Keep it simple. And always build in this unit from this basic idea. What is it? It's getting information in, it's keeping information, and it's getting it out when you need it, right? And of course, we're going to kind of fill in some blanks and add some details to each stage or each step of learning here. But really, it's what it is. Getting it in, it's called encoding. Storing the information, it's called storage, right? Or keeping the information. And then getting the information back out when you need it is called retrieval, right? So always start there with a very basic kind of process of memory, and then kind of build out from there as we start to learn more and talk about more details. So talk about getting information in, encoding. Okay, so how does that happen? Where is the information? Where does it start? It's out here in our environment, right? Whether you're listening to this video and listening to me talk, or you're looking at the screen, or you're reading a book, or you're watching someone tie shoes and then you're learning how to tie shoes. How does the information, or where does it come from? It comes from our environment, right? And I said we're going to build on parts of our course, and this is really a great example. How do we get information from our environment into our mind? We need to sense it. So go back to Unit 3 and talk about transduction, right? So if I'm going to see something that's on this computer screen, that light energy is going to enter in my eye. And we talked about that whole process of how the eye allows light in, focuses light, and then turns it into brain power, and that's called transduction. So the first step in memory, the first step, and more specifically in encoding, is taking environmental stimulus and turning it into brain power. We've talked about that throughout Unit 3, right? So the first step of encoding, sensing. And then how do we get that information further into the brain? We talk about selective attention, another part of Unit 3. We talked about perception. So we're seeing things all the time. There is just a massive amount of information, light photons and sound waves and chemicals being picked up by the nose and the mouth. Most of it is immediately filtered out, right? So a lot of what you've seen today, think about from the minute you woke up and opened your eyes, a lot of what you've seen that you saw kind of came in, not really that important, and was filtered out. Same thing, a lot of what you've heard, hopefully not this, came in, not that important, filtered out, right? Or you took some vague general meaning from what you were listening to or seeing. So pay attention. We can take that information a step further into the mind and put it into what's called the short-term or working memory, which is really your immediate consciousness. What are you thinking about at that time, right? And then lastly, how do we encode even deeper? What if it's something that's really important to us? Your phone number, right? Or your AP psychology material, or how to drive a car, or how to make macaroni and cheese. Very, very important things. How do we encode that into long-term memory? We need to consolidate that information, and we do that a few different ways, and we'll talk about those things. We'll kind of fill in the details as we move through here. But encoding, getting information in, sense it, pay attention to it, focus on it, or find it important and consolidate it into long-term memory. And then again, encoding is what we just talked about. Storage, keeping the information. A lot of what, and this is what our textbook says, so I'm going to roll with it. Psychologists kind of believe that storage and long-term memory, which is kind of where we keep things that we need indefinitely, is unlimited, right? You can never get to the point in your life where, well, there's not any more room for anything. Kind of like I know on my phone, or at least my older phones, you're out of memory. It's never a good sign. You can't take another picture or whatever. As far as most psychologists believe, and this is what our textbook says, long-term memory is indefinite. We've never found a limit on the capacity for long-term memory. It's a little different when we talk about the first two layers. Sensory memory, like your vision and your hearing especially, we're going to talk about iconic and echoic memory in the next video, hold a ton of information. Like I'm looking and seeing a bunch of things, and I can move around and look at, there's a lot of information out here I can take in. The problem with sensory memory, it's gone in a flash, right? As soon as you look away from something, most of what's going on over here to my right, I can maybe recall a few things that are over there, but a lot of information just falls off unless you reavert your attention. Working memory, we'll talk about short-term memory, and we'll do some activities in class. Can hold around 7 things at a time. You can think about 7 unique pieces of information at once. Okay? So storage, holding on to information. And then lastly, so we said you need to get information in, you need to store it, and you need to get it out. The get it out part is called retrieval, kind of like a dog, right? You throw a bone and the dog brings it back. It's retrieval. So I've got information stored in my brain, in my long-term memory, and when I need it, like if I see somebody from across the room that I think I recognize, like, man, what is their name? Like, that's a piece of information that's in there that I need to retrieve out of my mind. A couple keys to retrieval, and we'll talk about these throughout the unit as well, are mnemonics and understanding encoding specificity, which means where you create a memory, it's more easily retrieved in that same context or in that same space. So there's kind of this was in the textbook as well, but I thought it was really interesting. They did some research on people. A couple of keys to retrieval are retrieval cues. So having a couple of the keys to retrieval. One of the keys to retrieval are using retrieval cues. So have you ever had like a tip of the tongue phenomenon, which is something that we'll talk about in class, where you've learned this before, you know the answer, but it's stuck in there. Having retrieval cues or hints to help you access that information are really important. And I'm sure a lot of you have used mnemonics. Here you'll see mnemonics. It's a tricky word because it's got that silent M. But it's a memory aid. A lot of times you can make a song like I know I teach Ava the ABCs by A, B, C, D. It's a song. It helps you remember the ABCs. Tricky part about that one is when you get to L, M, N, O, P. If you're using a song, a lot of times kids go L, M, N, O, P, and it's one letter to them. So it can kind of backfire. But mnemonics, using acronyms too, like you see down here, how to remember the Great Lakes, show me, or I've seen Holmes for the 5 Great Lakes, right? Also, encoding specificity as a retrieval cue. Where you created a memory, it's easier to access that memory if you're in that same context. So kind of an interesting piece of research here that was done on people learning how to scuba dive. Psychologists got a hold of these people and said, hey, go down underwater while you're in scuba, look at this list of words, and then try to memorize as many as possible. And then the next lesson, come up with as many of those words from that list as you can. And what they found was people that were underwater remembered or were able to retrieve more of those words when they were back underwater trying to retrieve the information, as opposed to being on land. So you can see the data here. Same thing, people that were on land remember better on land versus underwater. It's kind of interesting, but it goes along with, I'm sure you've been sitting on your couch and thought of getting something out of your room. You walk upstairs, and what am I doing here? And then you go back down and you sit back on the couch. Ah, that's right. Same idea. It's called encoding specificity, or in this case, it's called context-dependent memory. Another thing we'll talk about in class. Okay, just a key rundown. What is memory? It's getting information into the mind, it's keeping it there until I need it, and then it's getting it back out when I need it, right? Encoding, storage, retrieval. Just kind of log that into your mind, encode that information, and store it for when you need it in psychology class here. Okay, that's step one of memory.